Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Saturday, September 23rd, 2017, Revere, Massachusetts. A routine check-in becomes an entry call. Neighbors and family can't reach a 30-year-old elementary school teacher named Vanessa McCormack. When the threshold is finally crossed, one instruction cuts through the tension. Call 911. Officers step into a residence that looks recently wiped down in select places but not lived in that morning. The air is sharp with a chemical odor. In the bedroom area, a trash bag is found where a pillow should be. Doors and frames show no sign of forced entry. In the kitchen, a large slot in the knife block is empty. This is where a homicide investigation starts, with what the room admits. Patrol isolates the scene. Detectives photograph from wide to tight, then lock the chain of custody. Nothing gets touched that doesn't have to. They mark white patterns on hard surfaces, note voids where blood spatter should appear but doesn't, and sketch the most direct path in and out of the sleeping area. It's methodical by design. If someone cleaned, the order of that cleaning leaves its own sequence. The approach is neither cinematic nor speculative. Investigators start a timeline the moment the door opens. Who discovered whom, who called, what time each patrol unit arrived, which areas were secured first. They pair that with the victim's last known commitments, lesson prep, messages, weekend plans, to determine a normal Saturday for a teacher who kept a steady schedule. People with consistent mornings don't just miss every check-in at once. When they do, time itself becomes the first witness. The residence does not argue back, but it does narrow options. No forced entry means fewer plausible ways in. A missing kitchen knife suggests a removed weapon rather than one discarded in plain view. A concentrated bleach odor points to targeted cleaning rather than routine housekeeping. None of those facts name a suspect. Together, they define a crime in residence with an attempted cleanup. The working question for detectives is simple. What did the cleaner miss? You'll hear me refer to the room, the clock, and the lab. That isn't poetry, it's procedure. The room fixes the geometry of the crime. The clock constrains opportunity. The lab tests whether the visible story holds up under chemistry and pathology. In cases like this, the room speaks first. The lab will speak last. Everything in between is translation. We will not rush to conclusions. The first chapter is about establishing the scene and preserving what matters for court. If the investigation is built correctly, you won't need a recovered weapon to understand how the homicide occurred. You'll need a coherent sequence that survives scrutiny. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Our job is to test that alignment. Before we step into the next phase, Vanessa's routine, relationships, and why a missed morning raised alarms, ask yourself, if nobody broke in, who had legitimate access and time to enter, stage, and leave this house without triggering a report until later? Hold that thought as we build the minute-by-minute map. Vanessa McCormack's life ran on a clock you could set your watch to. Weekdays meant an early start, lesson plans ready the night before, materials in a tote by the door. Weekends weren't lazy, they were structured. Grading, grocery runs, calls to family, and preparation for the next week with her elementary school students in Lynn, Massachusetts. For investigators, that kind of routine isn't background color, it's a baseline. When a person with predictable mornings suddenly drops off the grid, the first place you look isn't for drama. You look for the interruption. Detectives began by building a verified time map anchored to facts, last confirmed contacts, scheduled obligations, and third-party confirmations from the school community. Administrators and colleagues confirmed she had plans in motion for the coming week, materials requested, communications pending, and classroom tasks queued. Parents who interacted with her expected replies on simple weekend questions about supplies and Monday readiness. The lack of response wasn't normal for her. In cases like this, time becomes a form of physical evidence. A missed call is not just silence, it marks a point on the timeline where expectation and reality diverge. The work in Chapter 2 is procedural, not speculative. Investigators documented calls and messages to Vanessa and about her, who tried to reach her, when and how many attempts failed before concern escalated. They noted which planned tasks never triggered, which check-ins were skipped, and which routine errands didn't happen. That negative space, events that should have occurred but didn't, tightened the window for when the homicide could have taken place. In a school community, absence is noticed quickly. It isn't rumor, it's accountability. That accountability provided timestamps stronger than memory. The next step was corroboration. Interviews with family and colleagues were taken, not for opinion, but for structure. When she usually woke, when she prepped, when she left the house, which commitments she rarely missed. Every detail went into a linear sequence. The aim wasn't to prove motive or point to anyone. It was to establish the last normal, the final period where her life matched the pattern that always kept. The shorter that gap between last normal and discovery, the fewer people could realistically intersect the opportunity window. In coastal towns like Revere, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. But the job here is to remain clinical. If you allow emotion to steer the narrative, you start filling blanks with assumption. That's not how these cases hold up in court. What holds is the alignment between routine, unplanned silence and the time-stamped efforts by others to reach her. When investigators reviewed those outward attempts, calls that rang out, messages that went unread, calendar items that went stale, they weren't reading tea leaves. They were marking the edges of a window that would soon be compared against travel times, witness availability, and any activity linked to the residence. It matters that Vanessa was a teacher, because teachers live by bell schedules and prep periods. It matters that she had responsibilities that Sunday and Monday because those responsibilities create hard expectations, emails, lesson drafts, materials pickup. The failure to execute any of it isn't a mood, it's a flag. Investigators leaned on that uniformity to rule out long gaps. If a person with this profile fails to respond in the morning, fails again by midday, and doesn't engage with school-related obligations by late afternoon, the conclusion isn't that she went off the grid. The conclusion is that something prevented every ordinary behavior from continuing, and that prevention likely began inside the house documented in Chapter 1. Notice what we're not doing. We're not diagnosing the relationship, we're not narrating arguments, and we're not naming a culprit in Chapter 2. We're building the clock. When the clock is right, the rest of the puzzle either fits or it doesn't. That clock will later be tested against statements, travel narratives, and lab findings. For now, it serves one purpose: to narrow opportunity using the most reliable witness we have, Vanessa's own routine. The human side matters, and we'll treat it with respect. A well-run classroom doesn't assemble itself. A teacher's presence is felt when it's missing. But the tone here stays disciplined because disciplined is how you protect the case. One question at a time, one verified bracket at a time. As we move forward, keep in mind that a structured life gives investigators two advantages: a clear last known normal and fewer plausible times for a fatal event to go unnoticed. When we overlay this time map with scene mechanics, and later with forensic findings, the outline will sharpen. If you're following along, here's the practical question. Which single missed obligation in a structured weekend would you consider the strongest red flag? An unanswered call, a skipped prep task, or the absence of any response to a parent inquiry? Your answer mirrors exactly how investigators prioritize the early minutes of a case like this. Detectives return to the Revere residence with one purpose: convert a set of impressions into a readable scene. The first pass in Chapter 1 captured observations. This pass separated what was merely visible from what could be proven. Rooms were zoned, pathways were logged, and every measurement was tied to a photo index. The priority was sequence: what happened first, what followed, and what was done afterward to alter what the eye would normally see. They started at the bedroom threshold. Foot placement markers tracked a straight corridor to the sleeping area, then a controlled pivot near the bed. On hard surfaces, the team documented white patterns that ran in consistent lanes rather than random arcs, evidence of targeted cleaning rather than routine tidying. Adjacent items that should have registered transfer were conspicuously clean. That contrast, clean next to what should have been contaminated, mattered more than any single smudge. The bedscape included an object out of place, a trash bag at or near where a pillow would sit. Its position and condition supported one practical inference investigators are trained to test: containment. If you expect impact or blood loss, a barrier can limit spatter and make post-event cleaning faster. That is not speculation. It is a known tactic in in-home homicides. Door frames and strike plates showed no tool marks, no force spread, no broken components. Windows on the accessible side of the house were intact, latches engaged. The geometry told a consistent story, entry by someone with access or familiarity, not by defeat of a lock. A kitchen check noted a void in the knife block, one large slot empty, and confirmed ordinary knives remained. That discrepancy was logged as an inventory issue rather than a conclusion. A missing blade is not proof of a weapon used. It is a variable to reconcile against wounds described later by the medical examiner. The team then moved to pattern analysis. Under angled light, wipe lanes revealed directionality. The strokes were long and parallel, starting at contact height and moving outward. In high-traffic segments that should have shown diffuse transfer, there were islands of abnormal cleanliness, cleaner than surrounding areas, consistent with post-event attention. Importantly, those lanes did not cover everything. Corners, baseboards, and undersides of fixtures retained particulate that routine mopping fails to reach. That residual is where chemistry earns its keep. Presumptive tests were applied to selected sites where normal household cleaning would not focus. Positive indications at those margins supported the conclusion that blood had been present and later addressed. You don't need a visible pool if the periphery still speaks. The bathroom told its own story. Towels recently damp, a hamper with mixed textiles, and a drain trap later preserved for lab. Here, detectives treat water as a tool. Where it was used, how much, and what that use implies about cleanup time. If someone cleans themselves in surrounding surfaces, water consumption and moisture patterns often cluster in a narrow period. That cluster can then be compared to timeline bracketing from Chapter 2. The shorter the feasible window for both the assault and the cleanup, the more valuable each retained trace becomes. In the kitchen, the absence of the large knife remained a controlled unknown. Investigators documented the block, its manufacturer slots, and normal household placements. Sinks were swabbed, traps preserved, and the interior of trash receptacles reviewed. Household chemicals were photographed with caps off or on, volume levels estimated, and purchase patterns requested later by subpoena when appropriate. The point was not to dramatize bleach, it was to document that a chlorine-bearing cleaner appeared to have been used in a directed fashion. Parallel wipe lanes and odor persistence suggested timing closer to discovery than to an earlier housekeeping session. Children's items in a nearby area were photographed but not moved. Their presence in the space matters for context and for later legal relevance, but it does not change the method. The scene was processed the same way any in-home homicide is processed: wide to tight, clean to contaminated, public areas to private. Each collection decision was tied to the theory that a person committed a violent act, immediately attempted to limit trace evidence, and exited without damaging points of entry. If you map the house from above, you get an efficient path: entry, corridor, sleeping area, a pause consistent with assault, a pivot to bathroom, a return sweep, then kitchen contact where a tool would normally be retrieved or returned. The map cannot prove a motive and will not name a perpetrator. It can, however, define the order of operations, so the medical examiner's findings later either fit or fracture that path. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A tidy story can hide a messy reality, unless the corners still hold what the lanes missed. There is a human dimension that matters here. A teacher's home should read like a place paused, not a place reset. The reset, those unnaturally clean lanes, telegraphed control after violence. That is not a moral judgment, it's an investigative one. When a community watches a case like this, they want compassion. The best way to show it is precision. Precision keeps a case from collapsing months or years later. As the reconstruction wrapped, detectives had what they needed to move to the next discipline: pathology and lab. The room had admitted enough to say the homicide occurred inside, steps were taken to limit trace, and a potential weapon class was missing from ordinary storage. What remained was to test whether injuries and chemistry validated that sequence, and to see if any retained micro-evidence could tie back to actions in a narrow window established by Chapter 2's clock. A quick question for you as we move forward. If a cleaner misses only the corners, do you weigh those margins as more probative than a wiped countertop, and why? The first real leverage in this case came from the clock. Investigators treated every call, message, and planned obligation as a timestamp, something that either happened on schedule or failed to happen when it should. When a person like Vanessa McCormack runs on routine, time doesn't just measure a day, it narrows opportunity. They built the timeline from the outside in. Family outreach attempts were documented with precise times pulled from device logs instead of memory. Messages to Vanessa that normally drew quick replies stayed unread. Calendar items tied to her classroom went idle. Those negatives weren't speculation, they were data points that formed a bracket around when the homicide and the cleanup could have occurred. The bracket started with her last confirmed communication and ended with the 911 call that brought police to the door. That window was smaller than most in-home cases, and that mattered. Detectives then compared the timeline against what the residents revealed about recent activity. Moisture and heat patterns in the bathroom suggested concentrated use in a short period close to discovery. Towels were recently damp and placed in a way that indicated use rather than storage. A hamper contained mixed textiles that looked out of step with ordinary weekend laundry. Drain components were preserved because the volume and timing of water use can corroborate cleanup after violence. None of this answered who. It answered when. Phones were next. Investigators requested relevant call detail records and text metadata from carriers using proper legal process. They weren't looking for rumors or motives at this stage. They wanted to see whether outgoing or incoming activity conflicted with the house's story. If a device goes quiet while obligations pile up unanswered, that quiet has weight. If anyone claims to have been in touch at a time the network says no contact occurred, that claim loses traction. It is routine work in major cases. Narrow the period first, test narrative second. Neighbors and nearby contacts were asked about simple, verifiable points. When a car was seen, when a porch light switched, whether any loud disturbance was heard. Many cases depend on subjective recollection. Here, investigators prioritize short, confirmable observations that could be aligned with phone and response times. When those small pieces lined up, they did not tell a dramatic story. They drew a tight box around a portion of the morning when the offense most likely occurred and when someone appears to have tried to reset the room. The scene work from the prior chapter fed directly into this. Wipe lanes on hard surfaces ran in single directions rather than circular scrubs, suggesting speed and intent. The chemical odor was still strong, which supported recent use rather than an old cleaning session. Corners and undersides, rarely cleaned in routine chores, held residue that prompt wiping missed. Those indicators do not give an exact minute, but they support a conclusion that post-event cleaning was performed near the endpoint of the window built from communication gaps. Investigators also examined ordinary household rhythms. People who live by school schedules tend to move early. If the last normal activity finished at a particular time and nothing legitimate appeared afterward, no errands logged, no pickups, no social plans, then any narrative that pushes the homicide late in the day has to fight the data. The opposite is also true, where a suspect or witness claims an early discovery, but the bathroom still reads like it was used much closer to police arrival. The house pushes back. The timeline and the room have to agree, or someone is bending the story. To keep the case stable, the team resisted filling in blanks with opinion. They flagged anything that looked convenient. An alibi that lands perfectly between two calls. A memory that seems tailored to the minute. That is the kind of alignment that deserves testing, not acceptance. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The standard is simple. Either the alignment survives records, or it breaks under them. The human dimension remained visible, but controlled. Friends expected quick responses from Vanessa because that is who she was. Parents in her school community were used to steady, efficient communication. When those expectations failed in sequence, people noticed, and they noticed early. That early awareness is often the difference between a sprawling murder window and a narrow one. It is not emotion. It is accountability, turned into a tool. By the time the timeline was finalized for this stage, investigators had a compressed morning window bound on one end by the last normal activity and on the other by the 911 call. Inside that window sat the assault, the immediate aftermath, and an attempted cleanup that the house only partly concealed. The next step would test whether forensic pathology and lab analysis match that order of operations: blunt force trauma, strangulation, and sharp injury patterns consistent with what a missing large kitchen knife could represent, even if that knife was never recovered. I want to keep you engaged without dramatics. This is where cases either become clear or start to drift. If the lab and the time map fit, the path to charge is straightforward. If they do not, the case stalls. Before we move to the medical examiner's findings, consider this. When you look at a compressed time window for a homicide inside a locked home, with no forced entry noted, what kind of activity, call, text, or verified in-person contact would you treat as the strongest challenge to that window? When the window is tight and the room points to an in-home homicide, the next lever is paper and data. Investigators obtained financial records by warrant and subpoena, checking and credit card statements, ATM withdrawals, merchant logs, and any recent pawn or resale activity. They requested carrier metadata for call and text activity already used to build the time map, now to cross-reference against spending patterns. The question wasn't who felt stressed. The question was who was moving money, how fast, and to what end. The spending review did not look for a single gotcha charge. It looked for drift, cash withdrawals clustering around the days before the homicide, unusual point-of-sale activity, and transactions that did not match the normal household footprint. According to prosecutors later in court, the marriage had been under financial strain and there were allegations of cocaine use at roughly $500 a week. Whether that number was exact or rounded mattered less than the pattern it implied: repeated outflows, purchases, or debts that created pressure inside the home. Investigators treated those claims as leads, not conclusions. They asked where jewelry was, whether anything had been sold or pawned, and whether cash had been liquidated in small increments designed to avoid attention. Digital breadcrumbs were handled the same way: dispassionate and sequential. If a card was swiped at a store that sells cleaning supplies, the team did not leap to motive. They checked receipts, timestamps, and any available CCTV to see who made the purchase and when. If there was a gas station charge, they compared the time to the compressed window from Chapter 4. If there were attempts to sell valuables, they noted which items, what dates, and whether those sales aligned with reported arguments. In a case like this, alignment is either earned by records or it is not. The team did not fill gaps with narrative. Communications between the couple, to the extent they were lawfully obtained, were organized by topic: money, routine, and household obligations, then plotted against the calendar. Prosecutors later argued there were discussions about separation and divorce. The defense responded that arguments and debt do not equal homicide, and that the case must be decided on evidence that ties a specific person to a specific act in a narrow period. Both statements can be true in their lanes. Financial friction can be common. Homicide is rare. The work of Chapter 5 is to establish whether the friction left measurable tracks. The work of later chapters is to connect those tracks to the violence inside the home. One strand gained attention: the intersection between financial activity and the time needed to clean a scene. If you believe someone tried to reset a room, you ask whether they had the means and the minutes. Purchases of cleaning agents close to the date carry one weight if they reflect routine stocking, another if they are new or excessive. You match that against the odor persistence the officers documented and the directional wipe lanes the forensic team mapped. You also ask whether anyone was out of the house long enough to buy supplies without triggering concern, and whether that trip leaves a receipt, a camera frame, or a fuel charge that fits the clock. Another strand involved valuables. If jewelry or cash were missing from ordinary storage, you do not assume theft. You inventory, you check for insurance appraisals, and you look for quick sales that convert property into money. If those sales existed, you map dates and amounts. If they did not, the absence of a sale is its own fact. Prosecutors would later argue that hidden debt and drug spending created motive. The defense would say those arguments distract from the lack of a recovered weapon and any direct DNA. The point here is discipline. Motive can suggest direction, but it does not substitute for sequence. The human impact stays present but measured. Financial stress isolates people. Drug use magnifies that isolation and can destabilize a household. Communities see the symptoms: missed payments, unstable mood, arguments about what can be afforded, but they rarely see the ledgers and logs. Those ledgers are where investigations live. They explain whether pressure was episodic or chronic, whether the household had a plan to manage it, and whether recent days showed escalation that matches the narrow window defined earlier. In towns like Revere, people rally around teachers because teachers anchor families. That sense of duty is also why records matter. They let the truth stand without rumor. By the close of this phase, the case file contained a financial chronology that moved in parallel with the forensic chronology. On one page, white patterns, bathroom moisture, a missing large kitchen knife, and no forced entry. On the other, bank activity, cash flow irregularities, and allegations, clearly labeled as such, about cocaine use and marital strain. The two columns don't prove each other. They either converge or they don't. The data align too cleanly in a few places for comfort, which is exactly why the next chapter is not about theory. It's about the medical examiner and the lab, findings that can confirm or undercut everything built so far. Before we pivot to pathology, consider this simple challenge. When you weigh a homicide inside a home, what carries more evidentiary value in your view? A bank pattern that spikes before the crime, or a purchase of cleaning agents close to discovery that we can place in time? The medical examiner's table is where narratives are replaced by mechanics. In Vanessa McCormick's case, the autopsy documented a combination of injuries that explained death without guesswork: blunt force trauma to the head, evidence of strangulation, and sharp force injury to the neck region. Each mode carries its own signature. Together they establish a sequence consistent with a violent assault inside the home. The purpose here isn't style, it's causation: what happened to the body, in what likely order, and what the assailant did immediately after. Pathologists begin with external survey, then layer internal examination. Impact to the head is read through patterned abrasions, swelling, and hemorrhage beneath the scalp. Strangulation is supported by neck findings, soft tissue hemorrhage, petechiae where present, and injury to structures that resist routine household mishap. A sharp injury to the neck is evaluated by wound edge, depth, and directionality, then correlated with a class of weapon. Here, a kitchen blade would be consistent with what the scene inventory lacked, even if that knife was never recovered. None of this leaps past the evidence. It matches what the house showed in chapters 1 and 3 and what the compressed window allowed in chapter 4. The lab's job was to test whether the cleanup attempt changed trace in a way chlorine-based agents often do. Swabs from select surfaces produced chemical interference consistent with recent cleaning, but interference is not erasure. Presumptive tests at protected margins, baseboards, undersides, seams, registered reactions where routine wiping tends to miss. In those places, investigators collected samples for confirmatory testing. The pattern was the point: directed wiping along high contact planes, residue remaining in low access corners. That alignment reinforced the conclusion that post-event cleaning occurred close in time to discovery. Collecting from plumbing was just as important. Trapped contents can retain cells and diluted blood even when a sink looks clean. Those samples are preserved because they speak to behavior: washing hands, rinsing tools, or cleaning skin after an assault. When compared to the bathroom's recent use indicators, the fluid profile supported a short, concentrated window of washing activity rather than weekend tidying. That detail doesn't identify a person. It supports the timeline, the phone records, and missed obligations already built. Defense teams often stress the absence of a smoking gun DNA profile in a scrubbed scene. That criticism is fair to raise in court. It is also why totality matters. If chlorine exposure degrades or masks trace, labs still report the disruption itself, which becomes part of the evidentiary record. Here, the pathology, multi-mechanism violence, including strangulation, fit the prosecution's legal theory of first-degree murder under extreme atrocity or cruelty, while the chemistry explained why direct source attribution might be limited. The gaps aren't proof of innocence. They are artifacts of the cleanup the scene already implied. There is a human reality beneath the clinical language. Families want definitive answers. A medical examiner can't heal a community, but clear findings can stop rumor from taking root. In towns like Revere, that clarity matters. It allows the case to proceed on measurable facts: cause of death established, mechanisms defined, Sequence supported by the environment. When the lab and the autopsy match the house and the clock, an investigation moves from probable to prosecutable. As we close this chapter, the file now contains medical cause and method consistent with an in-home assault, laboratory evidence of directed cleaning that fits the morning window, and a weapon class that aligns with a missing large kitchen knife. The next step isn't storytelling, it's charging. Whether the sum of scene, clock, money trail, and medical science meets the legal threshold to bring the case into a courtroom. If you were weighing only these medical and lab findings against the timeline, which element feels most decisive to you? The strangulation evidence, the sharp force pattern tied to a kitchen blade class, or the chemical disruption that proves a cleanup occurred? Once the lab and the clock lined up, the file moved from investigation to charging mechanics. In Massachusetts, that shift is about thresholds. Probable cause is not a trial verdict. It is a well-supported reason to believe a specific person committed a specific crime. Detectives assembled a clean narrative for prosecutors: an in-home homicide, no forced entry documented at the doors or frames, directed post-event cleaning consistent with chlorine exposure, a missing large kitchen knife from ordinary storage, a compressed morning window derived from device records and missed obligations, and medical findings of blunt force trauma, strangulation, and a sharp injury to the neck. Motive context, financial strain, and alleged cocaine use was labeled as, prosecutors said, useful for direction but never a substitute for sequence. The probable cause affidavit did not rely on one dramatic fact. It relied on convergence. Scene mechanics supported that the assault and cleanup occurred inside the house. The time map showed there was little room for alternative scenarios. The medical examiner confirmed multi-mechanism violence consistent with extreme atrocity or cruelty under state law. The financial and digital chronologies supplied pressure and opportunity, but were kept separate from causation. When a case is built this way, each component is able to stand if another is attacked. That's intentional. The absence of a recovered weapon, a gap the defense would later stress, was accounted for by the documented knife block void and injury class, paired with the chemical evidence of recent washing. With the affidavit sworn, prosecutors pursued an arrest warrant. The suspect, Andrew McCormack, was taken into custody and arraigned on a charge of first-degree murder. As Massachusetts law requires in a capital offense, he was held without bail. At arraignment, the plea is procedural. The case truly begins at indictment, when a grand jury hears a summary of evidence and determines whether to issue a true bill. The presentation tracked the same disciplined structure: scene, timeline, lab, and context. The goal in the grand jury is not to win a trial, it's to show a path that a jury could later follow without speculation. Defense counsel's posture at this stage was predictable and appropriate. Emphasize what isn't there. No recovered knife, limited direct DNA due to chemical interference. Challenge the inference that cleaning equals culpability. Raise alternate explanations for financial irregularities and relationship friction. Those points set the table for motions practice: suppression, admissibility of certain statements, expert scope, and they pressure test the file before a jury ever hears it. A strong case survives that pressure because it is not propped up by a single fragile link. Prosecutors refined the theory of first-degree murder under the extreme atrocity or cruelty prong. The medical evidence allowed them to describe not just death, but the manner of death: blunt force head injuries, evidence of strangulation, and a sharp neck wound. Combined with a child present in the home and a cleanup the house itself recorded, the theory satisfied the statutory factors without overreach. That is what jurors are eventually instructed on: acts, not adjectives. Pre-trial, both sides fought over scope. Experts would be permitted to explain what bleach does to biological trace and why interference is not erasure. Investigators could describe wipe lanes and protected margins without speculating on motive. Financial records would be contextualized to show pressure and timing, not character. The court's role is to keep the trial on evidence that helps the jury decide facts. Nothing more, nothing less. This is the point where cases either settle into clarity or start to fray. Here, the structure held. The room, the clock, and the lab told the same story in different languages. The affidavit didn't promise what the evidence could not deliver. It promised what it could prove. And that is enough to walk a case into a courtroom. If you were sitting in the charging conference looking at this file, Which pillar would you rank as most persuasive for probable cause? The medical confirmation of multi-mechanism violence, the time-compressed window with no forced entry, or the chemical proof of targeted cleanup aligned with a missing kitchen knife? Courtrooms don't reinvestigate. They test whether the investigation meets the law. In Boston's Superior Court in 2019, the Commonwealth presented a case that moved the jury from 4 pillars to one conclusion: an in-home homicide in Revere, a tight morning window built from calls and obligations, medical findings of blunt force trauma, strangulation, and a sharp neck wound, and evidence that the scene was deliberately cleaned. The legal question wasn't, is this tragic? It was, does this satisfy first-degree murder under Massachusetts law, specifically extreme atrocity or cruelty, beyond a reasonable doubt? The prosecution's frame stayed inside the rules. They argued that multiple mechanisms of assault, delivered in a private space and followed by a directed cleanup, reflected both brutality and consciousness of guilt. The missing large kitchen knife wasn't dramatized as a prop. It was used to explain why the sharp force pattern mattered even without a recovered weapon. Pressure inside the household, financial strain, and alleged cocaine spending was introduced as context for escalation, clearly labeled as evidence of motive rather than proof of the act. And because a child was in the home during the window of violence, jurors heard how the law allows them to consider the circumstances surrounding the killing when they evaluate cruelty. The defense stayed where an effective defense should: the gaps. No weapon in evidence. Chemistry that disrupts direct DNA. Warnings about overreading routine purchases. Emphasis on the principle that suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not the standard. They pressed the jury to hold the Commonwealth to proof that ties a person, not just a theory, to a specific sequence in a specific slice of time. Jury instructions brought the language down to ground. First-degree murder in Massachusetts can rest on extreme atrocity or cruelty, the manner of killing, the number and nature of blows, the victim's suffering, and the defendant's indifference. The judge reminded jurors that circumstantial proofs are still proofs, and that they must weigh the total picture, not individual pieces in isolation. The law does not demand a recovered weapon when the medical evidence and the scene agree on what happened. Deliberations closed with a single outcome. In November 2019, the jury found Andrew McCormick guilty of murder in the first degree for the killing of Vanessa McCormick. Weeks later, as Massachusetts requires for that crime, the court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no alternative ending then, and there isn't one now. Appeals are where convictions are stress-tested, not retold. On review, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in May 2023 affirmed the conviction. The High Court rejected claims that would have unraveled the verdict. It found the evidence sufficient and the trial rulings within the bounds that protect a fair proceeding. The conviction and the life without parole sentence remain intact. That is the entire arc. September 23, 2017, homicide inside a home in Revere, Massachusetts. November 2019, verdict. December 2019, life without parole. May 2023, the state's highest court leaves the verdict where the jury put it. One case, one record, one result. There's a human truth we should say out loud, briefly and clearly. Vanessa McCormick was a 30-year-old elementary school teacher, a person whose days were built around showing up for kids and keeping promises. Precision in a case like this is a form of respect for her family, and for a community that had to sit through evidence they'll never forget. We don't honor victims with speeches. We honor them by getting the facts right and the law right. I'll leave you with one focused question as we close. When all 4 pillars align, scene, clock, lab, and lawful context, which one matters most to you when you picture a jury room vote? I've followed this case from the first entry log to the final ruling, and one lesson stays with me. Precision is compassion. When a home turns silent, the facts, scene, clock, lab, become a voice for the person who can't speak. We owe that discipline to Vanessa and to every community that depends on truth more than rumor. What safeguards do you trust most? Neighbors checking in, digital trails, or simple routine? If this story resonated, tell me where you're watching from or what we missed. And if it didn't, say why. If you value work like this, tap subscribe so you don't miss the next case.